The first thing my son ever taught his father was how shame feels. I remember the exact look on Daniel's face 19 years later when Ethan stepped out of that government sedan in his navy dress whites. My ex-husband's mouth fell open, his skin turned the color of old paper, and for one beautiful second, the whole world seemed to stop breathing. He had come to claim a son he'd never raised. He had no idea he was standing face to face with the man I had spent 19 years building from the ruins he left behind. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to the night Daniel walked out on us. It was October of 1998 in Chillicothe, Ohio, and the air had that cold edge that warns you winter is coming. I was 8 months pregnant, tired enough to cry over burned toast, and standing in the little spare bedroom we'd turned into a nursery. I'd spent all afternoon painting clouds on the pale blue walls. They weren't very good clouds, more like lumpy cotton balls, but I'd imagined our son staring at them someday from his crib. That thought had carried me through a lot back then. Daniel and I had been married almost 11 years. We weren't one of those couples people envied, but we'd been steady once. Solid. We'd met at church when I was 23 and he was 26. He had kind eyes and a laugh that made people trust him. Or maybe I was just young enough to mistake confidence for goodness. Things had changed after his promotion fell through at Whitmore Accounting. He'd been certain the regional manager position was his. He'd spent months talking about the raise the bigger house private school someday for our baby. Then they gave it to a younger man from Columbus. Something in Daniel hardened after that. He started coming home later. Stopped touching my stomach when the baby kicked. Stopped asking how I felt. And started looking at me like I was something heavy he'd been forced to carry. That evening, I heard his car pull into the driveway just after 9. I smiled despite myself. I'd made pot roast, though by then it was cold and dry in the oven. I thought maybe tonight would be better. Maybe he'd apologize for being distant. Maybe we'd sit together and talk about names for the baby. Maybe. I heard the front door open. Then close. But there were no footsteps toward the kitchen. No "Hey Maggie." Just silence. A strange waiting silence. I walked into the living room and stopped cold. Daniel was standing by the fireplace in his gray suit, still wearing his overcoat. In one hand was his leather briefcase. In the other was a manila envelope. His face was blank. Not angry. Not sad. Blank. And somehow that was worse. "Daniel," I said. He looked at my stomach first, then at me. There wasn't an ounce of warmth in his eyes. "We need to talk." Every woman who has ever heard those words knows what comes next. Still, my heart tried to bargain. Maybe it's about work. Maybe his mother's sick. Maybe. He tossed the envelope onto the coffee table. It landed with a flat, terrible sound. "Those are divorce papers." I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because my mind refused to process it. "What?" "I've filed already." The room tilted. "What are you talking about?" He exhaled, sharply irritated, like I was making him repeat something obvious. "I'm leaving." I stared at him. "Number?" It was all I could say. "Number." The word sounded small and stupid even to me. He looked away, jaw tightening. "There's someone else." The sentence hit harder than if he'd slapped me. I gripped the back of the couch to steady myself. "Who?" "Lydia." His secretary. 26 years old. Bright lipstick and heels too high for office carpeting. I'd met her once at the company Christmas party. She'd called me ma'am. I remember because it made me feel ancient. I swallowed hard. "Daniel, I'm 8 months pregnant." He laughed then. A cold, ugly sound. "Exactly." I blinked. "What does that mean?" His voice rose. "It means I'm done pretending this is what I wanted." I flinched. He stepped closer, years of resentment pouring out like poison finally uncorked. "You and your child are ruining my life." I felt the baby move sharply inside me as if startled. My hand flew to my stomach. Daniel's lip curled. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to spend my life trapped in this town, drowning in bills tied to diapers and feedings and PTA meetings like some pathetic cliché." Tears blurred my vision. "Daniel, please. Get out." I thought I'd misheard. "What?" "Get out of my house." "Our house?" He sneered. "My name is on the deed." I shook my head, trembling. It's 10 o'clock at night. Not my problem. I searched his face for mercy. For recognition. For the man I married. There was nothing there. Then he said the words I still hear sometimes when the house is quiet enough. Get out, you idiot. I packed one suitcase. He stood in the doorway and watched. Didn't help. Didn't apologize. Didn't even pretend this hurt him. When I waddled past him carrying that suitcase and my winter coat over one arm, he stepped aside like I was a stranger leaving a hotel room. Outside, the October wind cut through my sweater. I loaded my things into my old Chevy and drove 20 miles to my mother's farmhouse, crying so hard I had to pull over twice. Mama opened the door before I knocked. One look at my face told her everything. She wrapped her arms around me and held on. And as I sobbed into her shoulder, she whispered words that carried me through the hardest years of my life. Sometimes the people who leave make room for the ones God sends. 3 weeks later, my labor started just before dawn. And when the nurse asked what name to write under father on the birth certificate, I looked down at my perfect little boy and said quietly, "Leave it blank." People like to talk about courage as if it arrives all at once. Like there's some grand moment when fear disappears and a person suddenly becomes strong. That wasn't how it happened for me. Courage came in smaller pieces. It came the first time Ethan woke crying at 2 a.m. and I realized there was no one else coming to help. It came when I counted quarters at the grocery store while the cashier politely looked away. It came every time I smiled and said, "We're doing just fine," even when I wasn't sure we were. That's how most women survive, I think. Not through miracles. Through ordinary stubbornness. Ethan was born on a frosty November morning in Adena Regional Hospital, pink-cheeked and loud enough to wake half the county. The nurses laughed when they heard his cry. Well, one of them said that boy plans to be heard. She wasn't wrong. He had a strong little set to his jaw even then, like he'd arrived with business to attend to. Mama held him while I slept after delivery. When I woke, she was rocking him by the window with tears in her eyes. "He's got your father's hands," she whispered. That meant something to me. My father had been a quiet, honorable man who fixed tractors, kept his promises, and never once raised his voice in anger. He'd died 3 years before Ethan was born, and I'd missed him fiercely ever since. I liked believing some piece of his goodness had found its way into my son. We brought Ethan home to Mama's farmhouse because there was nowhere else to go. Daniel sold our house 6 months later and moved to Columbus with Lydia. I heard through town gossip that they married in the spring. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted him back, but because it proved how quickly a man can erase the life he once promised to cherish. The divorce settlement was thin enough to fold into a church bulletin. Daniel's lawyer had argued he was financially overextended. I couldn't afford to fight it. So I signed. And started over. Mama cleared out her sewing room so Ethan and I could stay there. I took a waitress job at Harlow's Diner in town, working breakfast and lunch shifts while Mama watched him. At night, after putting him to bed, I cleaned classrooms at Chillicothe High School. On weekends, I balanced books for Mr. Landry's hardware store. I was tired in ways I didn't know a human body could be tired. But every morning, Ethan would grin when he saw me, and somehow the world felt possible again. He was a good child. Not perfect. No child is. At 3, he colored all over Mama's wallpaper with blue crayon because he wanted to make the room happier. At 6, he punched a boy in Sunday school for calling another child stupid. At 9, he tried to build a rocket in the barn and nearly set a hay bale on fire. But he always told the truth when confronted. Always apologized when he was wrong. And always tried to do better. That mattered. When Ethan was 7, he asked about his father for the first time. We were sitting at the kitchen table doing spelling homework. He looked up and said it plainly without drama. "Why don't I have a dad?" I dreaded that question for years. I set down my coffee and chose my words carefully. "Some men help create life," I said, "but very few earn the right to be called father." He frowned in concentration. "Did mine not earn it?" "Number." He thought about that, then nodded, and went back to spelling mountain. Children can accept truths adults spend decades resisting. He never asked again. Not because he didn't care. Because he trusted me. That trust became the sacred responsibility of my life. By high school, Ethan had become the kind of young man people notice. Not flashy. Not loud. Quietly excellent. He played varsity baseball, made honor roll every semester, and volunteered every Saturday at the Ross County Veterans Center. That last part surprised me at first. Most boys his age wanted football games and girlfriends and excuses to avoid responsibility. But Ethan loved sitting with those old men. He listened to their stories about Vietnam, Korea, and in one case even World War II. He treated them with a respect that seemed older than his years. One afternoon I picked him up after volunteering and asked what he liked so much about it. He looked out the truck window for a moment before answering. "They know what matters." I smiled. "What matters?" He glanced at me. "Keeping your word." I had to blink back tears before driving. During his junior year, he came home carrying an envelope from Annapolis. The return address read, United States Naval Academy. My heart nearly stopped. He handed it to me, hands shaking. "You open it." I did. The acceptance letter was only 1 page, but I must have read it 5 times before the words settled into meaning. Appointment offered. Full scholarship. Officer training. A future bigger than anything I'd dared imagine. I looked up at my son, and for a moment all I could see was that newborn baby in the hospital blanket. He smiled nervously. "Well?" I started crying so hard I couldn't answer. He laughed and hugged me. Mama, older now and slower in her movements, stood in the doorway wiping her own eyes. "Your granddaddy would be proud," she said. And for the first time in years I thought maybe every hard mile had led exactly where it was supposed to. A month before Ethan's commissioning ceremony, I got curious and searched Daniel's name online. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me wanted proof that life had turned out better for him. It hadn't. Lydia had divorced him after 12 years. Financial records showed bankruptcy proceedings. His LinkedIn page was a graveyard of short-term accounting jobs. He looked smaller in his profile picture. Defeated. I closed the laptop and felt nothing. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, a black sedan pulled into Mama's driveway. A man stepped out. Older, heavier, but unmistakably Daniel. And the smile on his face told me he thought he still belonged there. For a moment I honestly thought I was imagining him. 19 years is a long time to carry anger, long enough for it to fade into something flatter, quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, more like sediment settling at the bottom of deep water. You know it's there. You just stop stirring it. But the second I saw Daniel standing at the edge of Mama's gravel driveway, all of it rose at once. The hurt. The humiliation. The memory of that October wind on my face as I stood 8 months pregnant beside my car, wondering how the man I'd loved could look at me like I was garbage he'd finally taken out. Time had not been especially kind to him. His dark hair was mostly gone now, what remained gone silver around the sides. He'd put on weight around the middle and there was a softness to him. I didn't remember the kind that comes from too much disappointment and too little purpose. But his smile was the same. Polished. Practiced. The smile of a man who had spent his life assuming charm would solve what character could not. I stood on the porch and didn't move. Mama was inside napping in her recliner. Ethan was still at officer training in Virginia, due home Friday night. It was Thursday afternoon. The cicadas buzzed lazily in the maple trees. And my past had come calling. Daniel lifted one hand as though we were old friends. Maggie. No one had called me that in years. Not since him. Why are you here? He gave a small laugh, almost wounded. That's quite a greeting. I said nothing. His smile faltered. He glanced toward the house, then back at me. I'd like to come in. Number. The single word landed harder than I expected. His expression tightened. I drove 2 hours. That was your decision. For a second I thought he might turn around and leave. Instead he sighed dramatically and climbed the porch steps. Up close I could smell expensive cologne trying and failing to cover stale sweat. He folded his hands like a man preparing for prayer. I'm here to see my son. There it was. No apology. No acknowledgement of 19 years. Straight to the claim. My stomach went cold. Your son. His jaw flexed. Yes. The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. You don't have a son here. His eyes sharpened. Don't do that. Do what? Punish me forever for a mistake I made when I was young. A mistake. That was what he called abandoning a pregnant wife. I crossed my arms. You were 37. He looked away, briefly irritated at being corrected. Then his face softened into what I suppose he thought was sincerity. Maggie, I was scared. I handled things badly. I know that. Handled things badly. Like forgetting to mail a bill. Not throwing your family away. He continued. I've had a lot of time to think. I've changed. I said nothing. He took my silence as invitation. I found Ethan online, Naval Academy, officer now. A strange pride slipped into his voice, as though Ethan's accomplishments reflected back on him. He looks just like me. The sentence turned my blood to ice. Number. He looked like my father. He looked like himself. But Daniel had always been the sort of man who mistook resemblance for ownership. You had no right to search for him. He's my flesh and blood. There's more to fatherhood than biology. His face hardened. There are legal rights here. The shift was immediate. Like watching a snake uncurl. I should have expected it. Men like Daniel only wear humility until it fails to produce obedience. He stepped closer. I've spoken with an attorney. That surprised me. Not because I thought he wouldn't. Because it meant this wasn't impulsive sentimentality. He'd planned this. I'm entitled to establish contact, and if Ethan ever receives inheritance benefits, anything substantial. I laughed. Actually laughed. He stopped mid-sentence. You think this is about money? The look in his eyes answered before his mouth did. This isn't about money. It was absolutely about money. He'd learned Ethan had become something important and assumed proximity might profit him. The same opportunism that had once sent him chasing Lydia and Columbus promotions was alive and well. Just older now. More desperate. I looked him straight in the eye. You abandoned him before he took his first breath. His nostrils flared. Blood is blood. The words hung there. Ugly. Ancient. As though biology were some sacred contract no behavior could break. I thought of every fever I'd sat through. Every late-night homework crisis. Every baseball uniform I'd scrubbed clean. Every overtime shift. Every sacrifice. And suddenly I felt calm. Because I knew something Daniel did not. Blood can begin a life. It cannot build one. Ethan comes home tomorrow, I said. His whole posture changed. Hope flickered across his face. He pictured what he wanted to see. A curious young man longing to know his father. A son eager to fill some imagined emptiness. He smiled. Good. I opened the screen door. Come back Saturday morning. His smile widened. For one terrible second he actually looked triumphant. As if he had already won. I knew you'd do the right thing. I almost corrected him. But I didn't. I simply watched him walk down the porch steps and back to his car. When he drove away, gravel crunching beneath his tires, my hands began to shake. Ethan arrived home Friday just after 8. Mama cried when she saw him. I did too. He'd grown leaner, stronger somehow. There was a stillness to him now, the kind men carry when responsibility has shaped them. Over dinner after Mama went to bed, I told him everything. Not the softened version I'd given him as a boy. Everything. The divorce papers. The affair. The words Daniel had said. Get out, you idiot. Ethan listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, silence filled the kitchen. Finally, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. You should have told me sooner. I wanted to protect you. His grip tightened gently. You did. Then he leaned back and looked toward the dark window. Let him come. There was no anger in his voice. No excitement. Just certainty. And somehow that certainty unsettled me more than rage ever could. Because in that moment I realized my son had become a man fully capable of facing the ghost who made him. And Daniel had no idea what was waiting for him. Saturday morning arrived clear and cool, the kind of early Ohio autumn day that makes the whole world feel freshly washed. The maple leaves along the driveway had just started turning gold. Mama was already in the kitchen baking biscuits, humming an old Patsy Cline tune under her breath like she did whenever she was nervous. She knew what was coming. None of us said much over breakfast. Ethan sat at the table in a plain gray t-shirt, drinking coffee and reading through something on his tablet. Calm as ever. No fidgeting, no pacing. No sign at all that he was about to meet the man who had abandoned him before he was born. I studied him over the rim of my mug and marveled at how self-contained he had become. At 19, Daniel had been restless and hungry for attention, always reaching for something just beyond him. At 19, Ethan already seemed anchored, steady in ways many men never become. He caught me staring and smiled. "You okay?" I nodded too quickly. He set down the tablet. "Mom." There was something about the way he said it, firm, gentle, reassuring. The way I used to say his name when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms. It nearly undid me. I just hate that he gets to walk in here after all this time. Ethan's expression softened. He doesn't get anything. I looked at him. He gave me the smallest smile. He gets whatever we decide to give. And just like that, the fear loosened its grip. At exactly 10:17, a dark Lincoln sedan rolled up the gravel drive. Daniel was punctual. He always had been when he wanted something. He stepped out in pressed khakis and a navy blazer, dressed like a man auditioning for respectability. He carried a bakery box from Schmidt's in Columbus, as though cinnamon rolls could make up for 19 years. Mama snorted when she saw it. Cheap man's peace offering. That made Ethan grin. Then another vehicle turned into the drive. A black government SUV. Daniel frowned. The SUV stopped near the porch. A uniformed driver stepped out briskly and opened the rear passenger door. And then Ethan emerged. He was dressed in full U.S. Navy service white. Immaculate. Every line crisp, every button polished, every movement measured and composed. The morning sun caught the gold shoulder boards and gleamed against the bright white fabric. For one breathless second, even I forgot to move. He looked extraordinary. Not because of the uniform. Because of the man inside it. Disciplined. Earned. Whole. Daniel froze halfway up the porch steps. The bakery box slipped in his fingers. His mouth opened slightly. He had expected a boy. Instead, he was looking at a naval officer. At the life he had forfeited before it began. Ethan climbed the steps and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. Then he turned to Daniel. "Mr. Reeves." Not Dad. Not Father. Mr. Reeves. The title landed like a slap. Daniel blinked, then forced a smile. "Son." Ethan lifted one hand. "Not rude. Simply final. My name is Lieutenant Ethan Reeves." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut paper. Daniel swallowed. "Yes, of course, Lieutenant." He extended his hand. Ethan looked at it for half a second before shaking it once. Firmly. Without warmth. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." We sat in the living room. Mama remained in her recliner knitting, which was her way of supervising without appearing to. I sat beside the window. Ethan took the armchair opposite Daniel. Daniel perched on the edge of the couch like a man at a job interview. He smiled too often. Talked too quickly. Tried too hard. "I've followed your achievements," he said. Ethan's face revealed nothing. "Have you?" Daniel hesitated. "Well, online, news releases, academy notices." How thoughtful. The politeness in Ethan's voice was devastating. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm proud of what you've become." That was the first crack. Because even he heard how empty it sounded. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Why?" Daniel blinked. "What? Why are you proud?" "Well, because you're my son." Ethan held his gaze. "What's my birthday?" The question hit like a hammer. Daniel froze. His eyes flicked briefly toward me, hoping for rescue. I gave none. "April," he said uncertainly. Ethan's expression didn't change. "My birthday is November 12th. Daniel's ears reddened. Ethan continued. "What hospital was I born in?" No answer. "What was my first school?" Silence. "What position did I play in Little League?" Nothing. Ethan sat back. Calm as still water. My mother worked 3 jobs so I could stand where I stand. She missed sleep meals and years of comfort. Daniel's breathing quickened. Ethan's voice remained even. "You gave DNA, she gave a life." The words struck harder because they were spoken without anger. Just truth. Daniel's face collapsed. For the first time since arriving, the performance dropped away. He looked old. Not merely aged. Old in spirit. His eyes filled. I was wrong. Ethan regarded him quietly, then said something I will never forget. No, wrong is forgetting an anniversary or saying something cruel in anger. He leaned forward. Absence is a choice repeated every day for 19 years. Daniel's breath caught. And then to my astonishment he began to cry. Not dramatically. Not manipulatively. The way men cry when denial finally breaks and they see the wreckage clearly. I was ashamed, he whispered. No, Ethan said. You are ashamed now. Back then you were selfish. The precision of it left the room still. Daniel lowered his head. He didn't argue. Couldn't. After a long silence, he looked up. His voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. Is there any way to fix this? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to me and waited, giving me what Daniel never had, a choice. In that moment, I understood that whatever happened next would not be revenge. It would be something far harder and far more powerful. Grace, if we were strong enough to offer it. For most of my life, I believed justice would feel louder. I thought if the day ever came when Daniel Reeves finally understood what he had done, there would be thunder in it. Some great satisfaction, some sharp and glorious sense of balance restored. Instead, what I felt sitting there in Mama's living room was something quieter. Not triumph, not even relief. Just stillness. The kind that settles over a field after harvest when all the hard work is done and the land finally rests. Daniel sat on the couch with his shoulders folded inward, his hands trembling between his knees. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Across from him, Ethan waited calmly. Not cold. Not cruel. Simply steady. The same way he had faced every challenge life had ever handed him. And then my son spoke. You can't reclaim lost years. His voice was even respectful and impossible to ignore. Daniel lifted his head. Ethan continued. But you can decide what kind of man you'll be with the years you have left. Daniel stared at him, confusion and fragile hope wrestling across his face. You'd let me try. Ethan glanced toward me. There was no pressure in his eyes, only trust. The same trust he'd placed in me since he was old enough to reach for my hand crossing a parking lot. He was letting me decide what happened next. And suddenly I thought of Mama's words all those years ago. Sometimes the people who leave make room for the ones God sends. For 19 years I had thought she meant Ethan. And she had. But maybe she also meant this moment. The chance to prove that pain does not have to be inherited. That someone can break a chain simply by refusing to hand it forward. I looked at Daniel. Really looked at him. The handsome arrogance that once defined him was gone. What remained was an aging man stripped bare by consequence. He had already lost nearly everything. His marriage to Lydia had collapsed after years of bitterness and betrayal. His career had stalled. His friends had drifted. Even his younger brother, I'd heard through town gossip, barely spoke to him anymore. Life had disciplined him in ways comfort never could. But discipline is not transformation. That part is chosen. And I realized I no longer needed him punished. Life had already done that. What mattered now was whether anything worthwhile could still be built from what remained. So I nodded to Ethan. His face softened. Then he turned back to Daniel. There are conditions. Daniel straightened immediately. Anything. Ethan's expression sharpened just enough to remind him this was no bargain to be manipulated. You attend counseling weekly. Daniel nodded. You volunteer every Saturday at the Ross County Veterans Center for 1 full year. He blinked. The veterans' home. Yes. Doing what? Whatever needs doing. Cleaning floors, serving meals, listening. Daniel swallowed. Ethan's eyes held his. No shortcuts, no excuses, no disappearing. The room was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Daniel asked almost timidly, and if I do all that? Ethan's answer was simple. Then we'll have coffee and talk like men who are meeting for the first time. Something broke open in Daniel's face then. Not grief exactly. Something gentler. Humility, perhaps. He nodded once slowly. I'll do it. And for the first time in 20 years I believed him. The year that followed surprised all of us. At first I expected excuses. Missed Saturdays. Half-hearted effort. old habits dressed in new promises. But every week Daniel showed up. At the Veterans Center, he mopped floors, wiped tables, delivered meal trays, and sat for hours listening to old men tell stories he had no choice but to hear. Stories about sacrifice, duty, regret, honor. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he changed. Not dramatically. No grand speeches. No desperate attempts to force closeness with Ethan. Just quiet consistency. The kind that cannot be faked for long. The counselors later told Ethan he never missed an appointment. Not once. Mama noticed it first. He carries himself different now, she said one afternoon after spotting him through the Veterans Center dining room window. She was right. The old hunger was gone from him. In its place was something humbler. Something steadier. It made him look more like a man and less like a performance. Exactly 1 year later, on a cool October morning, Ethan invited him for coffee. The same farmhouse. The same kitchen table where I had once told my son the truth about his father. Daniel arrived early, carrying no gifts this time. No bakery box. No props. Just himself. And somehow that was enough. The three of us sat together while sunlight spilled across the old pine table. They talked for nearly 2 hours. About Ethan's assignment in naval intelligence. About leadership. About responsibility. About the things that shape a man. Not once did Daniel call himself Dad. Not once did Ethan offer the title. Some things are not restored. And that is all right. Not every wound becomes invisible. Some simply heal strong enough to carry. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me. There were tears in his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. I studied him for a long moment. Then I gave him the truest answer I had. "You already have what matters more." He frowned. "What's that?" "A chance to become worthy of it." He nodded slowly. And for the first time in all the years I had known him, he smiled without wanting anything in return. Then he left. And I watched him walk down that driveway like a man finally heading home. If this story stirred something in your heart tonight, maybe that feeling has a name. A memory. A regret. A person you've been meaning to call. Life gives us fewer tomorrows than we think. If there's someone you still need to forgive or someone you need to become worthy of, don't wait too long. And if stories like this remind you that grace can still grow in broken places, I hope you'll stay a while, share your thoughts below, and join us again. Because sometimes healing begins simply by remembering we are not alone. The boy Daniel rejected became the man who taught him how to come home. I was standing in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., when my Uncle Richard pointed straight at me and said, "That woman stole $60 million from a dying old man." The room went silent. Reporters lowered their pens. One woman in the back actually gasped. Even the judge leaned back in his chair like he was preparing for a long afternoon. I remember smoothing my hands over my dark blue marine dress uniform just to keep myself steady. My heartbeat felt loud enough to shake the room. Richard Morgan stood there in a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. His silver hair was combed perfectly. His cufflinks flashed under the courtroom lights. To everyone watching on television, he looked like the respectable son of an American military dynasty. I looked like the scandal. Then Richard said something that changed everything. "She's not a Morgan," he snapped. "She never was." That was the moment I stopped being afraid of him. Because by then I already knew what his family had done to my father. And I knew exactly how badly they had underestimated me. 3 months earlier, I'd been stocking medical inventory at Camp Pendleton in Southern California, worrying about my mother's overdue pharmacy bill, and whether my truck would survive another summer. My life was painfully ordinary back then. I was 32 years old, a Marine Corps logistics officer, divorced, tired all the time, and still paying off debts from helping care for my mother during her cancer treatments. Most evenings I drove home to my little rental duplex in Oceanside, microwaved leftovers, and fell asleep in front of old reruns on television. Nobody would have looked at me and seen a woman connected to one of the wealthiest military families in America. Frankly, I wouldn't have believed it either. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost ignored it because the number was international. "Captain Emily Carter," the man asked. His voice sounded polished, educated, the kind of voice that belonged in expensive buildings. "Yes." My name is Walter Brenner. I'm calling from Keller and Vogel International Legal Services in Zurich, Switzerland. I actually laughed a little. I think you've got the wrong number. No, ma'am, he said calmly. I'm looking for the granddaughter of General Arthur Morgan. That name hit me like cold water. Even ordinary Americans knew who Arthur Morgan was. Decorated combat commander, defense consultant, cable news military analyst. One of those men who spent 30 years appearing in patriotic documentaries while politicians shook his hand. My mother hated him. That's about all I knew. Sir, I said carefully, I think there's been some mistake. There was a pause on the line. Then he said the sentence that turned my whole life upside down. Your grandfather, General Arthur Morgan, left you $60 million. I leaned against a supply cabinet because suddenly my knees didn't feel reliable anymore. Around me, Marines kept moving boxes and clipboards like the world was normal, but mine wasn't. I almost laughed. You have the wrong person. He replied calmly like he'd expected that reaction. Fly to Zurich. Say your father's name. Do not ask questions. Then he hung up. Just like that. No explanation. No sales pitch. Nothing. I stared at the phone for almost a full minute. Then Staff Sergeant Lewis walked by carrying a crate. You okay, ma'am? Yeah, I lied. Just a weird phone call. That night I drove to see my mother. She lived in a small assisted living apartment outside San Diego. The place always smelled faintly like coffee and old paperbacks. She was sitting near the window knitting when I walked in. The moment I said the name Arthur Morgan, her hands froze. I noticed that immediately. You never told me he was my grandfather. Her expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. That family has nothing to do with us. Mom, somebody from Switzerland called me. That got her attention. Real fear crossed her face. Not confusion. Fear. What did they say? I told her everything. By the time I finished, she looked pale. You are not going to Zurich, she said firmly. Why not? Because those people ruin lives. I sat down across from her. All my life you told me my father abandoned us. She looked away. That's what I believed was safest. Safest. Not true. Safest. I noticed my pulse quickening again. What does that mean? But she wouldn't answer. The conversation ended with both of us angry. I left around 9 o'clock and drove home through heavy coastal fog, feeling like my entire childhood had suddenly become unreliable. 2 days later, my half-brother Daniel showed up uninvited. Daniel came from my mother's second marriage. He owned luxury car dealerships in Arizona and wore expensive watches even to casual lunches. He walked into my duplex, looked around at my old furniture and said, "So this is where America's newest millionaire lives." I crossed my arms. Mom told you? She's terrified. She's hiding something. Emily, he sighed, you're chasing some fantasy because an old rich guy died. I handed him the business card Walter Brenner had emailed me. Daniel's expression changed slightly when he saw the firm's name. That's real, he admitted quietly. I checked too. Still he shook his head. You can't seriously be thinking about going. Why not? Because rich families like that don't suddenly hand money to strangers. I'm not a stranger if he was my grandfather. Daniel laughed bitterly. You really believe that? That irritated me more than I expected. You know what, Daniel, some people don't spend their whole lives measuring worth by money. And some people, he shot back, don't know when they're being manipulated. After he left, I sat awake most of the night staring at the old wooden box my mother kept hidden in her closet when I was little. Years ago, after she got sick, she'd finally given it to me. Inside were old photographs, military patches, yellowed newspaper clippings, and one torn picture of my mother standing beside a Marine officer whose face had been ripped away. I suddenly realized something terrifying. Maybe my mother hadn't destroyed that photograph because she hated him. Maybe she destroyed it because she was afraid somebody else would recognize him. 3 days later, I requested emergency leave from the Marines. The following Sunday, I boarded a flight to Switzerland carrying one duffel bag, my dress uniform, and more questions than answers. As the plane lifted over the California coast, I looked down at the fading shoreline and had the strange feeling that the woman leaving America wasn't the same woman who'd come back. The bank didn't look anything like I expected. After everything I'd imagined during the 11-hour flight to Switzerland, I thought I'd find giant marble columns, gold lettering, maybe even armed guards standing outside like something from an old movie. Instead, the building sat quietly beside a narrow street near Lake Zurich, tucked between luxury boutiques and a watchmaker's shop. No signs, no flags, just gray stone walls and dark windows polished so clean they reflected the cloudy morning sky. It looked less like a bank and more like a place where powerful people disappeared for private conversations. I stood outside holding my marine duffel bag, exhausted from travel and running almost entirely on coffee and nerves. For a moment, I nearly turned around. The whole thing still felt insane. $60 million? A grandfather I'd never met. A father nobody would explain. And one sentence repeating in my mind like a warning. Say your father's name. Do not ask questions. Inside the lobby was silent except for soft piano music. Everything smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished wood. Men in tailored suits moved quietly between offices carrying folders instead of computers. A young receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. May I help you? I suddenly felt ridiculous standing there in wrinkled civilian clothes with jet lag and military posture. I'm here to meet Walter Brenner. She typed something into her computer. I'm sorry, miss, there's no appointment under your name. Of course there wasn't. I swallowed hard. The receptionist gave me the kind smile people use on confused tourists. Then I remembered the instructions. My voice came out quieter than I intended. My father's name was Captain Jonathan Morgan. Everything changed instantly. The woman's expression froze, not confusion. Recognition. She stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward. One moment, please. Within 30 seconds, 2 older men in dark suits appeared from a hallway. One of them approached me carefully, almost respectfully. Miss Carter. Yes, please come with us. No more questions. No hesitation. They escorted me to a private elevator requiring a keycard and fingerprint scan. That was the moment I realized this situation was far bigger than inheritance paperwork. As the elevator rose, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. 32-year-old Marine officer from Oceanside, California. Boots worn from base life, hair pulled into a practical bun. Dark circles under my eyes. I did not belong in a place like this. The elevator opened onto an entire private floor overlooking Lake Zurich. That's where I finally met Walter Brenner. He was older than I expected. Mid-70s maybe, white hair, thin glasses, calm blue eyes that reminded me of doctors who already know the diagnosis before speaking. Captain Emily Carter, he said warmly, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. I shook it carefully. You really knew my grandfather. For over 40 years. He motioned toward a chair beside enormous windows overlooking the water. Coffee arrived almost immediately, real coffee, not the burnt motor oil we drank on base. I sat there holding the cup while Walter opened a thick file folder. Then he studied me quietly for several seconds. You resemble your father more than I expected. That sentence hit harder than the inheritance. Nobody had ever told me I resembled him before. Because nobody ever talked about him. What really happened to him, I asked? Walter folded his hands together. Your mother told you he abandoned the family. Yes, that was not true. The room suddenly felt smaller. I kept my face steady the way Marines are trained to do, but inside something was beginning to crack open. Walter continued carefully. Captain Jonathan Morgan served in Marine intelligence during the 1990s. Officially, he died during a classified overseas operation. Officially. Walter looked toward the lake before answering. General Morgan believed your father was betrayed. I stared at him. By who? He hesitated. Possibly members of his own family. I actually laughed once under my breath. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded impossible. But then again, 3 days earlier, I'd believed my grandfather didn't even know I existed. Walter slid several photographs across the desk. The first showed a young Marine officer standing beside General Arthur Morgan. My breath caught immediately. The officer had my eyes, my jawline, even the same serious expression I saw every morning in the mirror. Jonathan Morgan, my father. For a long moment I couldn't speak. He looked so ordinary. Not a ghost, not a villain, just a Marine. I felt angry suddenly. Angry at my mother. Angry at the lies. Angry at 32 years of missing answers. Walter gave me time before speaking again. Your grandfather spent decades trying to uncover what truly happened. And shortly before his death, he changed his will. Why me? Walter's expression softened. Because you enlisted in the Marines. I blinked. What? He followed your military career quietly for years. He believed you carried your father's integrity. I leaned back slowly, trying to process that. The old man had watched my life from a distance while I struggled through deployments, divorce debt, and hospital visits with my mother. Part of me felt violated. Another part felt strangely seen. Walter opened another folder. General Morgan's children expected to inherit his estate equally. Richard Morgan, I said quietly. Walter nodded once. Your uncle was displeased. That's one word for it. Walter almost smiled. Then his expression turned serious again. There is another matter. Of course there was. He handed me a sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's signature. Before I opened it, Walter spoke carefully. Your inheritance is protected under Swiss and American law. However, General Morgan attached personal conditions. I looked up. What kind of conditions? He requested that you review certain family records before claiming the estate. Why? Because he believed you deserved the truth. My fingers felt cold opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was firm but uneven from age. Emily, if you are reading this, then I failed to fix what my family destroyed. You are the last honest Morgan left. I stopped reading. The room became painfully quiet. Last honest Morgan. I didn't even know these people. Walter slid another folder toward me. Inside were photographs, military records, financial documents, and newspaper clippings spanning almost 30 years. Then I saw my Uncle Richard's name. Again and again. Defense contracts, weapons manufacturing, political donations, missing reports. I looked up slowly. What exactly did this family do? Walter answered carefully. Enough that your grandfather spent the final years of his life trying to make peace with God. That night alone in a luxury hotel room overlooking Zurich, I sat awake until nearly dawn, reading classified copies and faded letters. Around 3 a.m, I found something that made my hands shake. A letter from my father to my mother. It had never been opened, and suddenly I understood something terrible. My father hadn't abandoned us. Someone had made sure we never heard from him again. I barely slept after reading my father's letter. The hotel room overlooked Lake Zurich, calm and silver beneath the early morning fog, but my mind felt like a storm had settled inside it. Every piece of my childhood suddenly seemed unstable. For 32 years I'd believed my father walked away from us. Now I was staring at proof that somebody had erased him instead. Around 6 a.m, I made coffee using the tiny machine in the hotel room and sat beside the window rereading the letter. Claire, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll keep Emily away from the Morgan family. There are things my father allowed that he can never undo. I love you both more than my own life. Jonathan. I read those lines at least 10 times. Not one sentence sounded like a man abandoning his family. It sounded like a man trying to protect them. By the time I arrived back at the bank later that morning, exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes. Walter Brenner noticed immediately. You've been reading all night. Yes, and I sat across from him slowly. My mother lied to me my entire life. Walter adjusted his glasses carefully. Your mother was frightened, Emily. That doesn't excuse it. No, he admitted quietly, it does not. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Outside the massive windows, trams rolled quietly through Zurich streets, while businessmen hurried through cold morning drizzle. Everything looked peaceful out there. Inside me, nothing was peaceful anymore. I opened the folder again. There are references here to defense contracts and missing reports, I said. What exactly was my father investigating? Walter hesitated long enough to make me nervous. Then he spoke carefully. In the early 1990s, Jonathan Morgan discovered evidence that military suppliers were overbilling the government through fraudulent overseas contracts. That happens all the time. Yes, Walter replied. But this involved senior officials and private defense companies with political connections. I stared at him. And my family was involved? Members of your family profited from those contracts. The room suddenly felt colder. I'd spent my adult life serving in the Marines, believing honor mattered. Duty, integrity, sacrifice. Those words weren't decorations to me. Marines lose marriages, health, and years with family because we believe service means something. Now, I was learning my own bloodline might have used patriotism like a business strategy. I leaned back slowly. So my father threatened them. Walter nodded. General Morgan believed Jonathan intended to testify. And then he disappeared. Yes? I rubbed my forehead. You keep saying General Morgan believed. Why not say knew? Walter's face tightened slightly. Because no body was ever recovered. That sentence hung in the air between us. No body. I suddenly remembered all the years my mother refused to declare my father officially dead when paperwork required it. I thought grief had made her stubborn. Maybe she'd known something too. Walter handed me another file. These are private journals from General Morgan's final years. I opened one carefully. The handwriting was rougher than the letter I'd read overnight. I failed my son. That line sat alone on the page. Underneath it, I taught my children discipline, but not morality. I closed the journal for a moment. An old man nearing death had written those words while sitting on top of one of the largest fortunes in America. Money really could not protect people from regret. Walter spoke softly. Your grandfather became a different man near the end of his life. What changed him? You. I frowned. What does that mean? He followed your military career privately. When you enlisted after college instead of pursuing corporate work, he became hopeful. That's ridiculous. He never even contacted me. He believed your mother would refuse. Honestly, she probably would have. Still, anger continued building inside me. My entire life had been shaped by decisions made in rooms I was never allowed into. Decisions by wealthy, powerful people who kept secrets while ordinary people paid the price. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing in my chest since yesterday. What happens if I refuse the inheritance? Walter looked genuinely surprised. You would walk away from $60 million? I'm asking. He folded his hands together. Then the estate would likely revert to Richard Morgan and other surviving family members. I thought about my uncle standing in some giant Virginia mansion polishing his reputation, while my mother struggled to afford cancer medication. The anger inside me sharpened. No, I said quietly, that's not happening. For the first time since arriving in Zurich, Walter gave me a small approving nod. Good, I thought bitterly. Maybe there's a little Morgan in me after all. Later that afternoon, Walter arranged a secure video call with an American attorney representing the estate in Washington. That was the first time I heard my Uncle Richard's voice. You should have stayed in California, he said coldly through the screen. No greeting? No introduction? Just hostility. I sat straight in the leather conference chair. And you should have told the truth 30 years ago. His expression darkened immediately. You know absolutely nothing about this family. I know my father wrote letters my mother never received. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. You think Jonathan was some hero? He was reckless. He was a Marine. He was naive, Richard snapped. He thought exposing corruption would somehow purify the world. I noticed Walter watching silently beside me. Did you love him at all, I asked. That question seemed to hit Richard harder than I expected. For a second he looked older, tired. Then the mask returned. If you challenge this family publicly, he said, your life will become very unpleasant. I almost smiled. I'm a Marine, Mr. Morgan. Unpleasant is usually before breakfast. Walter muted the call before Richard could answer. For a few seconds the room stayed silent. Then Walter actually chuckled under his breath. Your grandfather would have enjoyed that. I surprised myself by smiling a little too. It disappeared quickly. Because underneath the tension another realization had begun settling into me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about humiliation. My mother spent decades struggling alone while these people lived in wealth and influence. My father died branded a traitor while others built fortunes. And now they wanted me quiet too. That evening, Walter took me to a small restaurant overlooking the lake. Mostly older couples filled the dining room speaking softly over candlelight and wine. You remind me of Jonathan, Walter said while cutting his steak. Everyone keeps saying that. It's not only appearance. What then? He also believed truth mattered more than comfort. I stared down at my plate. That belief got him killed. Walter was quiet for several seconds. Then he answered carefully. Yes, sometimes it does. Back in my hotel room later that night, I stood at the window watching lights ripple across the dark water. For most of my life, I thought revenge belonged to angry young men in movies. But standing there alone in Zurich, holding evidence of what had been stolen from my father, I finally understood how revenge begins. Not with violence, not with rage, with grief. Deep enough grief eventually hardens into purpose, and for the first time in my life I wanted the Morgan family to hurt the way my mother had hurt for 30 years. When I landed back in the United States, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary everything looked. People rushed through airports carrying coffee cups and backpacks. Families argued near baggage claim. Television screens played weather reports nobody was listening to. Meanwhile, I was carrying enough family secrets to destroy one of America's most respected military dynasties. I rented a sedan at Reagan National Airport and drove south toward Virginia through cold autumn rain. Walter Brenner had warned me the memorial service for General Arthur Morgan would attract politicians, retired military officers, corporate executives, and media personalities. He wasn't exaggerating. The service was held at a private chapel outside Arlington. Black SUVs lined the road for nearly half a mile. Men with earpieces stood near the entrance, pretending not to be security. As I parked, I suddenly became aware of my Marine dress uniform again. The dark blue coat, the medals, the polished shoes. For years, that uniform made me feel grounded. Now it felt like armor. The moment I stepped from the car, conversations nearby began slowing down. People recognized the name on the news already. The forgotten granddaughter, the surprise heir, the scandal. An older Marine standing near the entrance nodded respectfully when he saw my uniform. "Morning, Captain." "Morning, sir." Inside the chapel smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. Large photographs of General Morgan stood near the altar, showing him beside presidents, military leaders, and foreign dignitaries. America had loved this man. But judging by the tension in the room, his family had not. I spotted Richard Morgan almost immediately. He stood surrounded by attorneys and businessmen near the front pews. Expensive suit, silver hair, calm smile carefully designed for cameras. Then he saw me. His expression hardened instantly. A woman beside him whispered something urgently into his ear. Richard started walking toward me. The room gradually quieted as people noticed. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. I kept my voice calm. He was my grandfather. He was manipulated by opportunists at the end of his life. "That's strange," I replied. Walter Brenner described him as perfectly lucid. His jaw tightened. "You have no understanding of what you're walking into. I understand my father died while your family got richer. That landed harder than I expected." For just a second, Richard looked genuinely shaken. Then the anger returned. Jonathan destroyed himself. He was trying to expose corruption. Richard lowered his voice further. "You think the world rewards honesty, grow up." I stared at him carefully. That sentence told me more about the Morgan family than any legal file ever could. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. "Richard." An older man stepped beside us, wearing the uniform of a retired Marine colonel. Tall despite age, white hair cropped short, deep lines around sharp blue eyes. Richard immediately stepped back. "Colonel Harris," he said stiffly. The colonel ignored him completely and turned toward me. "You must be Emily." "Yes, sir." He shook my hand firmly. "I served with your father." Everything inside me froze. Richard muttered something under his breath and walked away without another word. Colonel Harris watched him leave. "That family still thinks money can control consequences. You knew my father well. Well enough to know he'd be proud of you standing here." That nearly broke my composure. We sat together near the back before the service began. While politicians delivered polished speeches about General Morgan's patriotism and leadership, Colonel Harris quietly filled in pieces of my father's story. Jonathan Morgan had been respected inside the Corps. Brilliant, stubborn, too honest for his own survival. He believed Marines were supposed to protect people, Harris said softly, even when it cost something. What exactly did he uncover? Harris glanced toward the front where Richard sat beside television cameras. Defense contractors were billing the government for equipment that never reached deployed Marines. I frowned. "You mean theft?" "Yes. And my family covered it up. Some of them." My stomach tightened. How deep did it go? Deep enough that good men got buried. The memorial ended with military honors outside beneath gray skies. A bugler played while cold wind swept across the cemetery lawn. I watched Richard shaking hands with senators and executives while photographers crowded nearby. Not once did he look toward me. That should have made me feel invisible. Instead, strangely, it made me feel dangerous. Later that afternoon, Walter arranged for me to stay temporarily at one of the Morgan family properties in Northern Virginia until legal proceedings began. Calling it a house felt ridiculous. It was an estate. Stone walls, iron gates, a library bigger than my entire duplex back in Oceanside. I wandered through silent hallways filled with military portraits and oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. Generation after generation of men who looked like they believed power belonged naturally to them. I wondered how many secrets lived inside those walls. That evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. "How bad is it?" he asked immediately. "What?" "The news." Apparently, several outlets were already covering the inheritance battle. I sank into a leather chair near the library fireplace. "You ever feel like your entire life was built on lies?" Daniel sighed heavily. "Emily? No, seriously, Mom knew things. She was protecting you. That's becoming everybody's favorite excuse." He went quiet. Then finally, "You sound angry." "I am angry." "At who?" I looked around the enormous room. At all of them. That included him too, honestly. Because even Daniel had mocked me before learning the inheritance was real. "You need to be careful," he warned. "Families with this kind of money don't lose quietly." "I'm not afraid of them." "That's exactly why I'm worried." After the call ended, I poured myself a glass of bourbon from the study bar and sat alone for a long time. Around midnight, I found myself wandering into General Morgan's private office. The room smelled faintly of cigars and old paper. One wall displayed military commendations. Another held family photographs. That's where I finally saw it. A framed photo of my father holding me as a baby. I stopped breathing for a second. He looked younger than I expected, smiling, proud. And beside the frame sat another photograph. General Arthur Morgan standing nearby watching us both. My grandfather had known me since infancy. I sat down slowly behind the desk. All those years my mother struggled. All those birthdays without answers. All those nights wondering why my father never loved us enough to stay. And somewhere behind these walls the truth had existed the entire time. The rage that rose inside me then felt cold, controlled, Marine-trained. Not emotional chaos, purpose. I finally understood something dangerous about revenge. The most powerful revenge isn't screaming. It's patience. And for the first time I started thinking less about surviving this family, and more about dismantling them. The hearing began on a rainy Monday morning in Washington, D.C. By then, my face had already appeared on cable news enough times to make strangers stare at me in hotel elevators. The forgotten Morgan granddaughter. The Marine heiress. The woman challenging America's most powerful military family. The media loved neat little headlines. Real life felt uglier than headlines. I stood outside the federal courthouse in my dark blue Marine uniform while reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. Captain Carter, did General Morgan secretly support you for years? Are you planning to sue the Morgan family? Do you believe your father was murdered? Flashes exploded in my face. Microphones pushed toward me. I ignored all of it and walked inside beside Walter Brenner and my American attorney Linda Carver, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who spoke like every word cost money. "You're doing well," she murmured quietly as we entered security. "I feel like I'm going to throw up." "That means you still understand consequences. Good." Inside the courtroom, Richard Morgan was already seated with 3 attorneys surrounding him like bodyguards. For the first time since meeting him, he actually looked tired. Not weak, but worn down. The past few weeks had damaged him badly. Financial journalists were investigating the Morgan business empire. Veterans groups were demanding answers about old defense contracts. Political allies suddenly stopped returning calls. The family that once controlled every room now looked defensive everywhere they went. Richard glanced at me as I took my seat. There was hatred in his eyes. But something else too. Fear. The judge entered and the hearing officially began. For hours, lawyers argued over estate law, mental competency, financial transfers, and trust structures complicated enough to make my head ache. I sat quietly most of the morning listening to strangers discuss my life like I was a business transaction. Then Richard's attorney called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand with the same controlled posture I used during Marine inspections. Calm breathing. Steady hands. Never show weakness publicly. Richard's attorney smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile people use before cutting something apart. "Captain Carter," he began smoothly, "before last month, you had never met General Morgan personally, correct?" "Correct. And yet you expect this court to believe he left you the majority of his estate." "I didn't ask for it." "But you accepted it." "I accepted the truth." A few reporters looked up quickly at that. The attorney continued. "Isn't it true you were experiencing financial hardship before learning of this inheritance?" "Yes." "So this money would dramatically improve your life. That's generally how $60 million works." A few quiet laughs spread through the courtroom. The attorney's smile tightened. "You claim General Morgan admired your military service." "I don't claim it. His letters say it." "Letters provided by Swiss attorneys, verified by handwriting experts." He paused, annoyed. Then he changed direction. "Captain Carter, are you aware your father was investigated for misconduct before his death?" Linda Carver immediately stood. "Objection." The judge allowed limited questioning. The attorney turned back toward me. "Answer the question." "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm also aware those accusations conveniently protected several defense contractors connected to the Morgan family." The courtroom became very quiet. Richard stared at me with visible anger now. The attorney shifted again. "You're suggesting a conspiracy involving respected military and business leaders." I looked directly at him. "No, sir, I'm suggesting greed." That landed harder. People understand greed. Even old jurists and polished lawyers understand greed. The questioning continued another 20 minutes before I was finally dismissed. When I stepped down from the stand, I noticed several older veterans seated in the public gallery watching me differently now. Not as a scandal. As a Marine. That mattered to me more than I expected. During lunch recess, I stood alone near a courthouse window drinking terrible coffee while rain streaked across the glass. That's when Daniel appeared. I hadn't seen him since Virginia. "You look exhausted," he said carefully. "You look nervous." "I am nervous." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "I found something." That got my attention immediately. Daniel handed me a worn bundle of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. My stomach tightened the moment I recognized my mother's handwriting. "What is this?" He looked ashamed. "Mom kept them hidden." I slowly untied the ribbon. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to my mother. All from Jonathan Morgan. My father had written for years, birthdays, Christmases, updates, promises he'd come home. None of them had ever reached me. I suddenly felt dizzy. Daniel spoke softly. "She was scared, Emily." "Stop saying that." His face tightened. "She thought the Morgan family would take you away. She let me believe he abandoned us." "I know." I looked down at the letters again. 30 years of stolen truth sitting in my hands. I should have felt grief. Instead, what I felt first was rage. Not toward Richard. Toward my mother. The realization hurt more deeply than anything else so far. Back inside the courtroom that afternoon, the hearing took a dramatic turn when Colonel Harris testified. The old Marine walked slowly to the witness stand, shoulders still straight, despite age. Richard's attorneys clearly underestimated him. That was a mistake. Colonel Harris spoke plainly, calmly, like a man too old to fear powerful people anymore. He described fraudulent military contracts, missing equipment, Marines deployed without proper supplies while executives collected bonuses. Then he said something that changed the entire room. Captain Jonathan Morgan attempted to report the corruption through official channels, Harris said. After that, his reputation was destroyed. Richard's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was already done. Then Harris looked directly toward Richard. "I watched good Marines bury your family's lies for 30 years. Richard's face drained of color. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw him not as a towering patriarch, but as an aging man cornered by consequences. After court adjourned, reporters exploded into chaos outside. Questions flew everywhere. "Captain Carter, do you believe your uncle belongs in prison? Will criminal charges follow? Is the Morgan Empire collapsing?" I didn't answer, because honestly something inside me had begun changing during the hearing. Watching Richard sit there pale and exhausted, I suddenly saw the truth more clearly. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was what happens when pride grows stronger than conscience. Richard hadn't looked powerful anymore. He'd looked haunted, and for the first time since Zurich revenge, no longer felt satisfying. It felt heavy. I won the case 3 weeks before Christmas. There was no dramatic applause in the courtroom. No music swelling in the background like old movies. Just a judge removing his glasses and saying the words calmly. "The court upholds the validity of General Arthur Morgan's final will and testament." That was it. $60 million. Multiple properties, trust accounts, investment holdings. The entire Morgan legacy now legally belonged to me. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then reporters rushed outside to break the news while attorneys shook hands and packed briefcases. Across the courtroom, Richard Morgan remained seated completely still. Not angry, not emotional, just tired, very tired. I stood there in silence, realizing something strange. After months of fighting, victory didn't feel the way I imagined. I thought revenge would feel powerful. Instead, mostly I felt sad. Linda Carver squeezed my shoulder lightly. "You did well," she said. "Did I?" She studied me carefully. "That depends on what you wanted." Honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded against barricades despite freezing rain. Questions flew at me from every direction. "Captain Carter, are you taking over Morgan Industries? Will you pursue criminal investigations? Do you plan to dismantle the Morgan family empire?" I stopped walking. For the first time since this story began, I answered directly. "My father believed service mattered more than profit," I said calmly. "That's all I'm interested in honoring." Then I left. No speech. No revenge performance. Just exhaustion. Back at the Virginia estate, silence filled the enormous house. Most staff had already been dismissed during the legal battle. The place felt less like a mansion now and more like a museum dedicated to loneliness. I wandered through the library where I'd first seen the photograph of my father holding me as a baby. That photo still sat on General Morgan's desk. I picked it up carefully. For 32 years, I believed my father abandoned me. Then I believed my family destroyed him. Now, after months buried in legal files and testimony, the truth looked more complicated. My father had tried to expose corruption. Richard and others protected the family empire instead of protecting him. Cowardice ruined everything. But cowardice and murder are not always the same thing. That realization mattered. Late that evening, Walter Brenner entered the library carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. "You should sleep," he said. "I don't think I can." He handed me a drink. "You resemble your grandfather tonight." "That's not comforting." Walter smiled faintly. "No, it rarely was." We sat quietly beside the fireplace for several minutes. Finally, I asked the question sitting inside me all day. "Did General Morgan love my father?" Walter answered immediately, "Very much." "Then why didn't he stop any of this?" Walter stared into the fire before speaking. "Because powerful men often confuse control with wisdom." I thought about that carefully. My grandfather spent his life commanding soldiers, influencing politicians, and building wealth. Yet in the end he failed at the one thing that mattered most: protecting his own family. The next morning I made a decision that surprised even me. I asked Walter to arrange a private meeting with Richard Morgan. Walter looked genuinely concerned. "Emily, I need to hear it from him." Richard was staying at a private medical residence outside Georgetown after suffering what newspapers politely called exhaustion. The truth was simpler. The man had been crushed by public disgrace. When I entered his room, he looked older than he had only weeks earlier. Smaller, too. Gone was the polished executive from television. This was simply an aging man sitting beside a window watching winter rain. "You came," he said quietly. "Yes." He nodded toward a chair. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, "Did you kill my father?" Richard closed his eyes. "Number." I believed him instantly. Not because he was honorable, because he sounded ashamed. "What happened then?" Richard stared out the window. "Jonathan threatened to expose everything. The contracts." "Yes." His voice had lost all arrogance now. "There were senators involved, contractors, military officials, too much money, too many reputations. And you protected them." "We protected the family." I felt anger rising again. "At the cost of his life." Richard swallowed hard. "We thought they would discredit him. Remove him from operations, quiet him." He paused heavily. "We never believed he'd disappear." The room fell silent. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "You abandoned him," I said quietly. Richard nodded once. "Yes. No excuses. No manipulation. Just truth." Then to my surprise, the old man started crying. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just silent tears from somebody finally too exhausted to maintain pride. "Your grandfather hated himself for it," he whispered. "He spent 30 years trying to buy forgiveness." That sentence settled deep inside me, because it explained everything. The inheritance, the letters, the investigations, the will. None of it was really about money. It was guilt, generational guilt wrapped inside wealth and patriotism. Richard wiped his face slowly. "I know you hate me." I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said honestly, "I think you're weak." That hurt him more than yelling would have. Before leaving, I stopped beside the door. "There's one thing I still don't understand." Richard looked up. "Why leave everything to me?" His tired eyes softened slightly. "Because you became the person this family pretended to be." I drove away from Georgetown through slow evening traffic feeling strangely lighter. Not healed, not peaceful, but clearer. For months revenge had fueled me forward. Now I finally understood something older people probably learn eventually if life gives them enough time. Most revenge ends with sadness, because no victory can return the years people stole from you. A week later, Daniel came to visit the estate. For once he arrived without expensive confidence or sarcastic jokes. "I owe you an apology," he said immediately. I raised an eyebrow. "That's new." I was jealous. "Of what?" "You." He laughed weakly. "You spent your whole life actually serving people while I spent mine chasing money." That sounded painfully familiar. We sat together in the library for hours, talking honestly for the first time in years. About Mom. About family. About how fear quietly poisons people across generations. And that night after Daniel left, I finally made my own decision about the Morgan fortune. Not revenge. Not power. Something better. "Ma'am, I see his daughter every day." The guard didn't even hesitate when he said it. He leaned back in his chair like he'd told that line 100 times before, like it was routine. Then he tilted his chin toward the glass doors behind him. "There she is coming out right now." I followed his gaze. A young woman stepped through the security doors with the kind of confidence that didn't ask for permission. She wore a tailored navy coat, her posture straight, her expression calm. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Everyone around her already knew who she was supposed to be. She walked right past the checkpoint without stopping. Without being asked. Without being questioned. The guard gave me a small, almost amused smile like he'd just proven a point. "You see," he said, "happens all the time. Folks think they can just walk in here and say they're family." I didn't answer right away. I just stood there watching her disappear down the corridor like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. Because according to him, she did. I let out a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. "Well," I said quietly, "that's interesting." The guard chuckled, already turning back to his paperwork. "So, unless you've got ID that says otherwise, I'm gonna have to ask you to step aside." I nodded once. Not offended. Not surprised. Just thinking. Because if she was his daughter, then who had I been all these years? I looked down at the visitor badge still in my hand. It felt suddenly lighter than it should have, like it didn't carry any weight at all. Then I looked back up at the door she'd just walked through. And I made a decision. "All right," I said, slipping the badge into my pocket. "I understand." The guard relaxed immediately, like the situation had resolved itself. But it hadn't. Not even close. Because I wasn't leaving. I was going to play along. I hadn't been back to my father's base in over 3 years. Not since the last time I'd stood in a room full of uniforms that outranked me in every possible way and realized I didn't belong in any of them. Not since I'd decided that whatever my father was, whatever he represented, it wasn't something I wanted to stand in the shadow of. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was simpler. I didn't understand him. Not really. To the world, he was General Thomas Hale, 4 stars. A man whose name carried weight in rooms I would never enter. The kind of man people stood up for when he walked in. The kind of man who didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. To me, he was just Dad. Or at least he used to be. We spoke on the phone a few times a year. Holidays mostly, birthdays when we remembered. Our conversations were polite, careful, like 2 people who knew each other well enough not to ask the wrong questions. 3 weeks ago, he called me himself. That alone was unusual. "Are you in town?" he asked. "No," I said. "Should I be—" A pause. "Then you might want to come by the base." No explanation. No details. Just that. I almost didn't go. But something in his voice. Not urgency. Not worry. Something else. Something measured. Like he had already made a decision and I was just being given the chance to catch up to it. So I drove out this morning. I wore something simple, neutral, nothing that would draw attention, no assumptions, no expectations. And within 5 minutes of arriving, I was being told I didn't exist. I stepped away from the checkpoint, moving toward the waiting area off to the side. A few plastic chairs, a coffee machine that had seen better days, and a view of the same hallway that woman had disappeared into. From here I could watch. And that's exactly what I did. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. People came and went, officers, enlisted personnel, civilians with badges clipped neatly to their jackets. No one stopped me, no one asked me to leave. I was just another visitor. Another person with no real place in the system. Until I saw her again. She came back through the same doors slower this time, talking to a man in uniform, mid-level, maybe a colonel. His posture was relaxed around her. Familiar. Too familiar. She smiled at something he said. Not overly friendly, not inappropriate. Just comfortable. Like she had earned that space. I leaned forward slightly, watching the way they moved together. The way the guards at the checkpoint didn't even glance up when she passed again. No ID check. No confirmation. Nothing. The colonel stopped just short of the exit, saying something low enough I couldn't hear. She nodded, then continued on her own, heading toward the parking lot. For a moment I considered following her, seeing where she went. But that wasn't the point. The point was inside. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes drift back to the checkpoint. The guard from earlier was still there, same posture, same relaxed confidence. Certain of what he knew. Certain of who he had seen every day. I stood up. Walked back toward the desk. He looked up as I approached, recognition flickering across his face. "Oh," he said, "you still here?" I smiled just a little. "Just waiting for a ride," I said. He nodded, already losing interest. That was fine. I didn't need his attention. I needed his routine. I glanced at the badge scanner beside him, watched as another officer walked up, tapped his card, and passed through without a word. Simple. Predictable. Repeatable. I let a few more minutes pass, watched, listened, learned. Then when the moment felt right, I moved. Not quickly, not hesitantly. Just naturally. Like I had done it before. Like I belonged. I stepped into line behind a group of personnel heading through the checkpoint, close enough not to stand out, not so close that anyone would question it. The guard barely looked up. One by one they scanned their badges. The door opened. Closed. Opened again. My turn. I didn't have a badge. But I had something else. Timing. The officer in front of me scanned his card and stepped through. I followed half a second behind just as the door was still closing. The guard said something, but it wasn't sharp, not alarmed. Just routine. Hey, ma'am. I turned slightly, meeting his eyes with the same calm expression I'd seen on her face. Confident. Unbothered. Expected. He hesitated. Just for a second. And in that second, I was already inside. The door clicked shut behind me. And just like that, I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the system. At least for now. I walked forward without looking back, my pulse steady, my mind clear. Somewhere deeper in the building, my father was waiting. And if he knew what was happening at his own gate, then this wasn't a mistake. It was a test. And I had just decided to take it. I kept walking as though I knew exactly where I was going. That was the first rule I remembered. Not from my father, but from years of being his daughter. People questioned uncertainty faster than they questioned access. If you looked lost in a place that ran on rank and routine, somebody would notice. If you moved with purpose, most people stepped aside. The hallway beyond the checkpoint was quieter than I remembered. Polished floors, pale government walls, framed unit photographs, a display case holding plaques, challenge coins, and retirement gifts from commands I only recognized because I'd heard their names across dinner tables when I was younger, and still foolish enough to think men like my father spent their lives talking about medals. In truth, he had rarely talked about the work at all. He came home with silence on him the way other men came home with cigarette smoke or engine grease. I passed a reception desk staffed by a woman in civilian clothes, maybe late 50s, glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up briefly, saw my face, then looked back down at her computer. Either I had been mistaken for someone expected, or she had learned the same lesson as the guard: don't challenge what appears to belong. I took the left corridor not because I knew where it led, but because the woman from the checkpoint and the colonel had disappeared in that direction earlier. A posted directory listed administrative offices operations, planning, legal liaison communications, and command suites on the upper level. The farther I walked, the clearer it became that this was no simple front office arrangement. The building ran on layers public enough to allow visitors at the gate, private enough to hide what mattered 2 doors deeper. At the end of the corridor, I slowed near a bulletin board covered in notices: family readiness meetings, blood drives, retirement ceremonies, chapel announcements. The ordinary life of a military base was all there in thumbtacks and printer ink. It grounded the place. People married here, raised children here, lost friends here, retired here. For all the stars and salutes, most of military life still came down to casseroles after funerals, and somebody's wife organizing blankets for a storm drive. That ordinary quality made what I had just seen feel stranger, not less. I heard footsteps and turned just enough to avoid looking obvious. The same colonel from earlier was coming down the hall with a folder tucked beneath one arm. Mid-50s, trim silver at the temples, easy stride. The kind of man who had spent decades inside systems and learned how to make himself look indispensable without appearing hungry. He stopped near a door marked Executive Operations and glanced behind him. A second later, the young woman appeared. Up close, she looked more polished than before. Early 30s, perhaps. Dark hair pinned neatly, tasteful jewelry. No badge visible from where I stood, though she moved as though she had one. She wasn't dressed like military family. She looked like someone who understood exactly how much money and discipline it took to appear effortless. The colonel lowered his voice. I edged nearer the board and pretended to read a flyer about a volunteer luncheon. "You'll need to be careful this afternoon," he said. I always am, she replied. Her voice was low and composed with the faintest trace of southern softness under the polish. She sounded practiced, too, not theatrical, prepared. The briefing's been moved up, he said. No extra stops. She gave one small nod. Understood. Then she smiled at him in a way that made my stomach tighten, not flirtatious, not affectionate, but allied. The smile of one person who knows another is covering the road ahead. He handed her the folder. Not openly, not secretly, smoothly. If I had blinked, I might have missed it. She tucked it beneath her arm and continued down the hall without another word. The colonel watched her go for half a second, then turned the other direction. I stayed where I was until both were gone. My father had spent his whole life teaching me one lesson without ever sitting down to say it. When something is wrong, don't react too quickly. Let the shape of it appear. So I let it. The woman was not a harmless social visitor. No one moved that comfortably through restricted space by accident. No one got handed a folder in a hallway outside executive operations unless the handoff mattered. And the colonel, whatever his exact role was, too seasoned to be careless. I moved again slower this time. At the next intersection, I caught sight of the woman entering a smaller conference room just off a side corridor. The door didn't close all the way. I passed by without looking in, then stopped at a water fountain 20 feet beyond it. The hum of voices drifted out. One male voice, hers, then another man's younger, sharper. I waited until footsteps echoed from farther down the hall, creating just enough ambient noise to cover my own movement. Then I stepped back and angled myself near the half-latched door. Said he'd sign off if the general never sees the full chain, the younger man was saying. He won't, the woman replied. Not if today goes the way it's supposed to. I felt the back of my neck turn cold. The first male voice, older, likely the colonel, spoke next. No improvising. We're too far in for mistakes. Too far in. Not starting. Not considering. In. I heard paper slide across a table. Then the woman said something that made me go absolutely still. If anyone asks, I was in the family office most of the morning. They're used to seeing me there. The family office. It was such an odd phrase that I nearly doubted my own hearing. My father had no family office. He had never been that kind of man. He handled personal matters the same way he handled everything else, privately, directly, and without decoration. The phrase sounded invented. A title designed to justify presence. A title repeated often enough to become routine. Suddenly, the guard's words at the gate took on a darker shape. I see his daughter every day. Not daughter. Position. A role someone had built and fed into the building until everyone stopped questioning it. I backed away before they could finish. I didn't need more yet. What I needed was to avoid being seen too soon. I turned the corner and nearly collided with a young lieutenant carrying a stack of binders. He caught one before it slipped and gave me a quick, apologetic smile. Sorry, ma'am. No harm done, I said. He looked at me again as though trying to place my face. Not suspiciously, curiously. Then his eyes widened just a touch. Oh, I didn't realize you were back. Back. My heartbeat didn't change, but something inside me sharpened. I just arrived, I said carefully. He nodded too fast. Of course, my mistake. Before I could ask what he meant, a buzzer sounded down the hall, and an overhead speaker announced that senior staff should report to briefing in 10 minutes. The lieutenant hurried off. I stood there for one quiet moment and understood two things at once. First, this woman had been here long enough to be recognized as part of the structure. Second, I wasn't the only one some people expected to see. Whatever game was being played inside my father's command, it wasn't built on one lie. It was built on many small ones repeated until they became the air in the room. And for the first time since I stepped through that checkpoint, I stopped feeling like an outsider who had wandered into danger. I felt like someone my father had expected all along. That was the thought I was still holding when a deep, familiar voice sounded from behind me. You got farther than most people do. I turned. My father stood at the end of the corridor in full dress uniform, 4 silver stars on his shoulders, his face unreadable. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked late to a meeting he had been willing to postpone only once. For a moment I didn't move. I had imagined this meeting in a dozen different ways over the past 3 years. Awkward, formal, maybe even distant. But not this, not him standing there like he had been watching the entire time. You got farther than most people do, he repeated. His voice hadn't changed. Still low, still controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to rise to carry authority. I took a step toward him. "I had help," I said. His eyes shifted just slightly toward the hallway behind me, the direction of the conference room, then back to me. "Yes," he said, "you did." That was all. No surprise, no questions. Just confirmation. And in that moment, everything inside me settled into place. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. He held my gaze for a long second, then gave a small nod. "I suspected," he replied. "Now I know." I let out a slow breath. "So the guard at the gate, the lieutenant, the colonel—" "Conditioned," he said. "Over time." The word landed heavier than anything else he could have said. Not fooled. Not mistaken. Conditioned. Like it had been done carefully, repeatedly, quietly. I crossed my arms not out of defensiveness but to steady myself. "And you let it happen." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped past me and gestured down the hall. "Walk with me." I followed. We moved side by side, his pace measured, unhurried. Anyone passing us would have seen nothing unusual, just a general and a civilian walking through his command. But I felt it. The shift. The weight of what wasn't being said. "You think I let it happen," he said finally. "I think you didn't stop it," I replied. A faint hint of something, almost a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "Stopping it too early," he said, "would have solved the wrong problem." I glanced at him. "And what's the right problem?" He stopped walking. So did I. Then he turned to face me fully. "The question isn't who she is," he said. "The question is who benefits from her being here." I held his gaze. "And you didn't know?" "I didn't have proof," he said. "Not the kind that holds when people start denying things." That sounded like him. Not reactive, not impulsive. Deliberate. Always deliberate. "So you built a case," I said. I watched, he corrected. I waited. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard. The folder, the mention of the briefing. "They're moving today?" I said quietly. His expression didn't change, but I saw it. That small shift in his eyes. "Yes," he said, "they are." "And you knew that too?" "I knew something would happen soon," he replied. "Your timing helped." I almost laughed at that. "My timing?" He looked at me for a moment, then said, "You showed up unannounced. Walked through a restricted checkpoint without authorization. Observed without interfering." A pause. "That's not an accident." I studied him. "You think I came here as part of your plan?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you came here because you knew something was wrong, even if you didn't know what." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. Because he wasn't wrong. I hadn't known why his call had unsettled me. But it had. And I had come anyway. He turned and resumed walking. "This way," he said. We moved toward a secured door at the end of the corridor. He entered a code, scanned his badge, and the door unlocked with a soft click. Inside was a smaller office, quiet, controlled, removed from the rest of the building. A desk, 2 chairs, a wall-mounted monitor displaying security feeds from different parts of the base. He gestured for me to sit. I didn't. Not yet. "I heard them," I said, "in the conference room." His eyes flicked to me. "What did you hear?" "Enough," I said. "She's not acting alone." "I know." "The colonel—" "Chief of staff," he corrected. That made sense. Too much sense. "And the other one," I continued. "Younger, nervous." He nodded once. "We've identified him." I exhaled slowly. "So what's the plan?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the monitor and tapped a key. One of the camera feeds expanded, showing the hallway outside the conference room I had just left. A few seconds later, the door opened. The woman stepped out. She looked composed, controlled, exactly as before. But now I knew better. "She believes she's invisible," my father said. "She's not," I replied. "No," he agreed, "she's not." Another feed came up, this one showing the briefing room. Officers were beginning to take their seats, papers being arranged. Conversations kept low. Routine. On the surface. "She'll move during the briefing," he said. "How?" He reached over and picked up a folder from his desk. Held it up. "This," he said. I looked at it, then back at him. "A decoy?" I asked. "A test," he corrected. Of course it was. Everything with him was a test. "And if she takes it?" I asked. "Then we confirm the chain," he said. And if she doesn't? He set the folder back down. Then we wait longer. I shook my head slightly. You've been waiting how long? Long enough, he said. I studied him for a moment. Then asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I saw that woman walk through the checkpoint. Why didn't you tell me? I said. He met my eyes. Because I didn't know if I could trust you with it. The honesty of it didn't sting the way it might have once. Instead, it felt fair. And now I asked. A pause. Then, you walked in without a badge, he said. Observed, adapted, didn't react emotionally. Another pause. I trust what you do more than what you say. That sounded exactly like him. I nodded once. All right, I said, then tell me what you need. He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Stay exactly where you are, he said. I frowned slightly. That's it. That's it. I glanced at the monitor again. The woman was moving down the hallway, heading toward the briefing room. Seems like I could be more useful than that, I said. You could, he agreed, but usefulness isn't the same as control. I looked back at him. And you want control. I need control, he corrected. A beat passed between us. Then I understood. He wasn't just watching them. He was controlling the board. Every move. Every piece. Including me. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms. All right, I said, I'll stay. He nodded once. Then turned back to the monitor. The briefing room was nearly full now. The stage was set. And somewhere in that room, a lie was about to reveal itself. I watched the screen, my pulse steady, my mind clear. For the first time since I stepped onto the base, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was part of the plan. And whatever happened next was already in motion. I stayed where he told me to stay. It went against instinct. Every part of me wanted to move, wanted to follow her, to stand inside that briefing room and watch it unfold from the front row. But my father had never confused activity with control, and I'd learned long ago that the quickest way to lose both was to act too soon. So I sat in the chair opposite his desk, hands folded loosely in my lap, eyes on the monitor. On the screen, the briefing room had filled to capacity. Senior officers took their seats with the quiet efficiency that came from years of doing the same thing at the same hour in different buildings across the country. Papers aligned, pens set down, phones silenced. It was a room trained to be ready before the meeting began. She entered last. Not late, precisely on time. The door opened and she stepped in with the same composure I'd seen at the gate at the checkpoint in the hallway. No badge check, no hesitation. The man at the door gave her a brief nod and stepped aside. She didn't look at anyone directly, but I watched the way people noticed her. Not in a startled way, not even in a curious one. Just a subtle shift, shoulders, straightening eyes, lifting the smallest adjustment in posture that signaled recognition. Familiarity. Acceptance. Conditioned, my father had said. The words settled in again, heavier now. Watch the left side of the room, he said quietly. I followed his instruction. The Chief of Staff, Colonel Brenner, sat 3 seats down from the head of the table. He had his folder open, a pen resting between his fingers. From this distance, he looked exactly like what he was supposed to be: experienced, composed, focused on the work in front of him. Nothing about him suggested risk. Nothing about him suggested ambition beyond the acceptable. But I had seen the hallway. I had heard his voice. He didn't look toward her when she entered. He didn't need to. The connection between them had already been established elsewhere, out of sight, where it couldn't be measured. Most people watch the loud ones, my father said. They miss the ones who don't need to be. I nodded slightly. And the younger man, I asked. He tapped a key, switching the angle. The second camera showed the far end of the table. There. Mid-30s maybe, short-cropped hair, lean build, his uniform crisp but not worn with the same ease as the others. He adjusted his papers too often, looked up too quickly. His attention wasn't on the meeting. It was on her. Captain Ellis, my father said, logistics liaison. He looks like he's waiting for a cue, I said. He is. The room settled as my father entered the frame. Even on the screen, his presence changed the air. Conversations ended without being asked to end. Chairs straightened. The quiet that followed wasn't forced, it was expected. He took his seat at the head of the table. Good morning, he said. No raised voice, no unnecessary words. Just enough. The briefing began. Routine updates first, operations, personnel, supply chain movements. It all sounded exactly like what it was meant to be, the steady, unremarkable rhythm of a functioning command. But I wasn't listening to the content. I was watching the edges. Watching her. Watching him. Watching the space between them. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then my father did something small, so small that no one outside the room would have noticed. He closed his folder. Before we move on, he said, I'd like to review the revised logistics projections. He didn't look at anyone in particular, but the effect was immediate. Captain Ellis stiffened. Just slightly. Colonel Brenner's pen paused above the page. And she didn't move at all. Captain Ellis, my father continued, you have the updated figures. Ellis cleared his throat. Yes, sir. He reached for his folder. Not the one in front of him. The one just to his left. I leaned forward in my chair, the motion almost unconscious. That's not his, I said quietly. No, my father replied, it's not. On the screen, Ellis opened the folder. I saw it then. The faint mark in the corner of the top page, a subtle notation, nothing obvious. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Or unless you had put it there yourself. A decoy. A test. Ellis began to speak, reading from the page. His voice was steady at first, confident enough to pass. But the numbers didn't match the earlier report. They couldn't. Because they had been altered. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough for someone who wasn't supposed to have access to them to reveal that they did. I watched the room. Some of the officers frowned slightly, not in alarm, in confusion. Brenner spoke next. Those figures don't align with the previous projections, he said calmly. Ellis hesitated. For half a second. Then he adjusted. Updated this morning, sir, he said. Brenner nodded once. As if that made sense. As if he expected it. I felt something settle into place. They've done this before, I said. Yes, my father replied, more than once. On the screen, she finally moved. Just a shift of her hand. A small adjustment of the folder in front of her. But it was enough. Enough to confirm that she knew exactly what was happening. That she had expected this moment. That's her signal, I said. My father didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the next move wasn't hers. It was his. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged. Captain, he said, would you mind explaining how those revisions were authorized? The room went still. Ellis looked up. Directly at him. For the first time since the meeting began. He started. And stopped. Because there was no good answer. No clean path forward. Only the one they had prepared. I watched his eyes flicker. Toward Brenner. Then. Toward her. Just for a second. But it was enough. It was always enough. Sir Ellis said, forcing his voice back into place, the adjustments were made based on updated supply reports. Which were reviewed by my father asked. Another pause. Longer this time. By operations staff, sir. Names, my father said. No anger. No pressure. Just a request. Ellis swallowed. And in that moment, I saw it. The fracture. Small. But irreversible. Because the system they had built, the routine, the conditioning, the quiet repeated lies, it only worked as long as no one asked the wrong question. My father had just asked it. And there was no rehearsed answer left. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This is where it breaks, I said. My father's eyes stayed on the screen. No, he said. A beat. Then quietly. This is where it reveals. On the monitor, Ellis opened his mouth again. And this time, whatever he said next would decide everything. Ellis opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For a moment, the room held its breath with him. 30 years in uniform had taught most of the men and women at that table how to sit through silence without flinching. They knew when something had shifted, even if they didn't yet know what. My father didn't move. He didn't press. He simply waited. It was the kind of waiting that made people reveal more than any question ever could. Sir Ellis said finally, his voice tighter than before, the names are in the appendix. He tapped the folder. Not the one that belonged to him. The one he wasn't supposed to have. I felt my jaw set just a fraction. That was his choice then. To lean into it. To trust the system that had carried him this far. On the monitor, Colonel Brenner reached for his own copy of the documents, flipping to the same section Ellis had referenced. His movements were smooth, practiced. Not a trace of uncertainty. Appendix C, he said almost helpfully. He didn't look at Ellis when he said it. He didn't need to. The room followed along, pages turned, pens hovered, a few heads nodded as if the explanation made sense. It was almost convincing. Almost. My father let it settle for exactly 3 seconds. Then he spoke. Appendix C, he repeated. That's interesting. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Because Appendix C, he said, was removed from the official distribution at 0600 this morning. No one moved. Not at first. Then I saw it. A ripple. Not visible in large gestures. No one stood up. No one raised their voice. But in a room like that, the smallest changes were the loudest. A pen stilled. A page stopped mid-turn. Ellis froze. And Brenner did something even more telling. He didn't look surprised. He looked thoughtful, as if recalculating. They must have been working from an earlier version, Brenner said, calm and even. Circulation delays happen, especially when updates are made close to briefing. It was a good answer. Clean. Plausible. The kind of answer that would satisfy most people in most rooms. But not this one. Not today. My father turned his head slightly, finally looking directly at Brenner. Colonel, he said, are you suggesting that Captain Ellis accessed outdated material and presented it as current without verification? Brenner held his gaze. I'm suggesting, he said, that we clarify the timeline before drawing conclusions. Measured. Careful. Still trying to control the pace. I watched Ellis. His breathing had changed. Subtle, but there. His shoulders weren't as steady as before. His eyes moved too quickly between Brenner, the papers, and my father. He was waiting. Waiting for direction. Waiting for permission to correct course. But Brenner didn't give it. Not yet. Because the plan, whatever it had been, relied on confidence. On momentum. And that momentum had just been interrupted. My father leaned back again as if considering the suggestion. Very well, he said. Let's clarify. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a second folder. Not the one on the table. A different one. Identical on the outside. But not on the inside. Even through the monitor, I could feel the shift in the room. Because now there were 2 versions of the same thing. 2 realities. And only one of them was real. This, my father said, holding the folder up just enough for the room to see, is the official version of the report distributed at 0600. He set it down in front of him. Captain, he continued, would you mind reading the figures from page 4? Ellis didn't move. Captain, my father repeated. Ellis swallowed. Yes, sir. He turned to the page. But before he could speak, a voice cut in. Sir. It was her. For the first time since the meeting began, she spoke. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. She sat, composed, hands folded lightly over her own folder. No sign of panic, no sign of urgency. Just control. If I may, she said, there seems to be some confusion regarding document versions. I was present during the early morning revisions. My pulse slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. Because this was the move. She wasn't retreating. She was stepping forward. Taking ownership. My understanding, she continued, is that multiple drafts were circulated among staff before final approval. It's possible Captain Ellis received one of those interim copies. Her tone was calm. Professional. Respectful. She didn't look at Ellis. She didn't look at Brenner. She looked only at my father. And for a moment, just a moment, I could see how this had worked. How she had become part of the system. She didn't challenge authority. She aligned with it. Just enough. Just often enough. To be trusted. To be accepted. To be invisible. My father regarded her quietly. And you are, he asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. Not loud. But impossible to ignore. A flicker, just the smallest flicker, crossed her face. Then it was gone. Clara, she said, I assist with family liaison and administrative coordination. Family liaison. There it was again. The invented role. The comfortable lie. My father nodded once as if considering it. "And your authorization for access to these materials?" he asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. But sharper. "I've been working with Colonel Brenner's office," she said. Not a direct answer. A deflection. Clean, efficient, and entirely dependent on one thing: Brenner backing it. I watched him. This was the moment. The decision point. He could distance himself. He could contain the damage. Or he could commit. He chose. "She has clearance through my office," Brenner said. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Full alignment. And just like that, the line was drawn. Not between right and wrong, but between truth and what they had built in its place. I leaned back slowly in my chair, the weight of it settling in. "They're all in," I said quietly. My father didn't look at me. He didn't need to. "Yes," he said. On the screen, he closed the second folder. Gently. Deliberately. Then he looked around the room. Not at one person. At all of them. "Good," he said. A single word. But it carried something new. Not curiosity. Not patience. Finality. Because that, he continued, makes the next part much simpler. The room didn't react. Not yet. But I felt it. That shift. That moment when control fully changes hands. The trap wasn't being set anymore. It had already been sprung. And for the first time, they were starting to realize it. No one spoke. For a few seconds, the room held that fragile balance between confidence and doubt, the place where people who had been certain a moment ago began to reconsider what they thought they knew. My father let it sit. He didn't rush the moment. He never did. Then he reached for the small control panel beside him and pressed a single button. The lights dimmed slightly. The monitor at the front of the briefing room came to life. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Just a hallway. A familiar one. The same corridor outside executive operations. I leaned forward in my chair without realizing it. Because I knew what was coming. On the screen, time-stamped footage began to play. 0607 hours. The hallway was quiet. Then, the door opened. Clara stepped out. She looked exactly as she had earlier, composed, controlled, unremarkable. But now every eye in the room was watching her. Not as background. As evidence. She moved down the hallway. Stopped. And a moment later, Colonel Brenner entered the frame. The same easy stride, the same measured calm. He spoke to her briefly. The audio wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. No extra stops. Her reply came just as steady. "I always am." A few heads in the room turned toward Brenner. He didn't move. On the screen, he handed her the folder. The same one Ellis had used. The same one that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The room didn't react all at once. It never does. Instead, it happened in pieces. A chair creaked. Someone exhaled too sharply. A pen dropped. Small things. But each one louder than the last. The footage continued. Clara walked away. Brenner remained in the hallway for a moment longer. Then turned. And looked directly into the camera. Not startled. Not surprised. Just aware. The video froze on that frame. My father stood. Slowly. Not in anger. Not in triumph. Just in control. "Captain Ellis," he said, his voice. "Even would you like to revise your earlier statement?" Ellis didn't answer. He stared at the screen like it might change if he looked long enough. Like it might give him a different ending. It didn't. He began. Then stopped. Because there was nothing left to say. My father turned slightly. "Colonel Brenner," he said. Brenner didn't look at the screen. He looked at my father. Steady. Measured. But the ease was gone. Just enough to notice. "Sir," he said. "Your office provided clearance," my father continued. "Would you like to clarify the nature of that authorization?" Brenner held his gaze. For a moment I thought he might try again. Try to reshape it. Reframe it. But something in the room had shifted too far. The evidence wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a record. And records? Records don't argue. They remain. She assisted with administrative coordination, Brenner said finally. Careful. Still careful. And the transfer of restricted documents, my father asked. A pause. Longer this time. Brenner's jaw tightened slightly. I'll need to review the full context before making a statement, he said. There it was. The retreat. Not denial. Not admission. Delay. My father nodded once. As you wish, he said. Then he turned his attention to Clara. She hadn't moved. Not even when the video played. Not even when the room shifted around her. She sat exactly as she had before. Hands folded. Back straight. Composed. But now the room saw her. Not as a familiar presence. As a question. And you, my father said. Her eyes met his. Calm. Still calm. Yes, sir. You stated you assist with family liaison. I do. For which family? A beat. Then, yours, sir. The answer landed softly, but it carried weight, because it wasn't entirely a lie. That was the clever part, the dangerous part. My father studied her for a long moment. Then he said, Number. Just that. No anger. No raised voice. Just no. You assist with access, he continued, access you were not authorized to have. The room went still again. But this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was clarity. He stepped away from the table, one measured step at a time, until he stood at the head of the room. Between them. Between the truth and what they had tried to build in its place. Security will enter this room in 30 seconds, he said. No one reacted immediately. Then, the sound of the door unlocking. Footsteps in the hallway. Firm. Precise. Expected. Clara's composure shifted then. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone untrained to notice. But I saw it. The smallest tightening around her eyes. The calculation. The realization. This wasn't a moment she could talk her way through. This wasn't a system she could blend into. This was the end of it. The door opened. 2 military police officers stepped inside. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. They had orders. Colonel Brenner, my father said you are relieved of duty pending formal investigation. No hesitation. No softness. Just fact. Brenner stood slowly. For the first time since I had seen him. He looked his age. Not weak. But human. I understand, he said. Clara remained seated. The officers approached her next. Ma'am, one of them said, we're going to need you to come with us. She stood. Gracefully. Even now. Even at the end. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply adjusted. Like someone who had always known this was a possible outcome. As they guided her toward the door, she glanced back once. Not at Brenner. Not at Ellis. At my father. And for a brief second, something passed between them. Not respect. Not quite. Recognition. Of the game. Of the outcome. Of who had controlled it from the beginning. Then she was gone. The door closed behind her. And just like that, the room exhaled. My father turned back to the table. His gaze moved across each face. Not accusing. Not lingering. Just acknowledging. You are trained to trust what you see repeatedly, he said. That is not a failure. A pause. But it is a vulnerability. No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. The system had been tested. And it had broken. Not entirely. But enough. Enough to matter. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension settle out of my shoulders. It's over, I said quietly. My father didn't look at me. But I heard it in his voice when he answered. No, he said. A beat. Then, it's accounted for. And somehow, that felt more final than anything else. The room didn't return to normal. Not right away. People gathered their folders, but more slowly than before. Chairs slid back with a softer sound. Conversations, when they began again, stayed low, careful, like everyone was aware that something fundamental had just shifted under their feet. No one rushed out. Not even the ones who probably had somewhere else to be. Because moments like that don't end when the door closes. They linger. They settle into the walls, into the habits, into the way people look at one another afterward. My father dismissed the room with a simple nod. That will be all he said. No speech, no lecture. Just enough. One by one they stood. Some of them glanced at him on their way out, brief, respectful, perhaps a little more thoughtful than they had been an hour ago. Others avoided looking at anyone at all. Captain Ellis paused at the door. He didn't turn around. "Sir," he said, not quite steady. "Yes." A beat. Then, "I should have checked." My father didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "you should have." There was no anger in it. Just truth. Ellis nodded once, then left. The door closed. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just complete. I watched the empty chairs on the screen for a moment longer, then leaned back and exhaled slowly. Well, I said that answers a few questions. My father turned off the monitor. The room dimmed slightly as the screen went dark. "It answers the ones that mattered," he said. I studied him. "You already knew most of it," I said. "I knew enough to wait," he replied. "And now?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window on the far wall. It looked out over a stretch of the base orderly rows of buildings, a flag moving in the breeze, a handful of personnel crossing the lot below, with purpose in their steps. For a man who had spent his life inside systems, he had always preferred to look outward. "It gets documented," he said finally, "investigated, processed the right way. No shortcuts. No quiet fixes." That was something else I had learned from him. "Even Brenner?" I asked. He nodded. "Especially Brenner." I let that settle. There had been a time when I might have asked why. Why not handle it quietly? Why not protect the reputation of the command? But I already knew the answer. Because reputation built on silence doesn't hold. Because systems that don't correct themselves eventually fail. Because for all the power my father carried, it wasn't meant to shield the truth. It was meant to serve it. I stood up from the chair, stretching slightly, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders from sitting still for so long. So I said, "What happens to the guard at the gate?" My father glanced back at me. "He followed what he was trained to follow," he said. "He'll be retrained. Not punished. Not dismissed. Corrected." "That seems fair," I said. "It's necessary," he replied. We stood there in the quiet for a moment. Then I asked the question I hadn't asked yet. "Why did you call me?" He turned fully this time. "Not as a general. As my father. Because I needed to know if you would see it," he said. "See what?" He held my gaze. "The difference between what people say something is," he said, "and what it actually becomes when no one questions it." I considered that. Then gave a small nod. "And if I hadn't come," I asked. He didn't hesitate. "I would have finished it without you," he said. Of course he would have. "That wasn't the point. But you did come," he added. "And that mattered." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Yes," he said. That was all. But it was enough. I walked with him back toward the hallway. The building felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had, or maybe because I finally understood it the way he did. At the checkpoint, the same guard was still on duty. He looked up as we approached. And this time, he stood. Straight. Immediate. His expression shifted the moment he saw my father. "Sir," he said, snapping to attention. Then his eyes moved to me. Recognition didn't come right away. But something else did. Uncertainty. The kind that comes when a person realizes the version of reality they've been relying on might not be the only one. My father stopped in front of him. "At ease," he said. The guard relaxed slightly. "Sir, he began. My father raised a hand. Not to silence him. Just to pause him. "You did your job," he said. "Now you'll learn to do it better." The guard nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." My father stepped aside, giving me a clear path to the exit. For a moment I just stood there, looking at the door. At the sign that still read, "Restricted Area." Then I turned back to the guard. "My name is Claire Hale," I said calmly. "I don't come here often." He blinked. Processing. Then, "Yes, ma'am." Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just adjusting. Learning. I gave him a small nod, then walked out into the daylight. The air felt different outside. Cooler. Cleaner. Or maybe that was just me. I paused at the edge of the lot and looked back at the building. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Solid. Ordered. Unchanged. But I knew better now. Systems don't stay strong because they never face pressure. They stay strong because someone is willing to test them, to question them, to correct them when they start to drift. My father had done that today. Quietly. Completely. And in his own way, he had trusted me to see it. I got into my car but didn't start it right away. Instead, I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, thinking about everything that had just happened. About how easy it would have been to walk away at the gate. To accept what I was told. To let someone else define what was true. And how different the outcome would have been if I had. I let out a slow breath. Then finally started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The building grew smaller behind me. But the lesson didn't. In a world where things are repeated often enough to feel real, it matters who is willing to ask one more question. If this story meant something to you, if it made you pause or think or remember a moment when you chose to question instead of accept, I hope you'll carry that with you. Maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, quiet ones, thoughtful ones, the kind that stay with you, I'd be honored if you stayed with me.